Well, hello, friends, and welcome to another episode of Orange Weekly, presented by Crouse Health. We're live here on the Syracuse Orange football Facebook page. We're live here on the Syracuse Orange basketball Facebook page, and we're also live on Syracuse Orange Sports on YouTube. We like to pop on here live Thursdays, about 1 o'clock or so. If you do miss the show live, though, maybe you're watching this right now, sometime in the future on YouTube. We put the YouTube clip up on the page itself. The both Facebook videos archive on Facebook automatically. We do a post on syracuse.com. I'll fire it off on the SYR football and SYR basketball Twitter feeds. So easy to find if in case you can't catch the show live here on Thursdays. Your comments and questions welcome on a couple of things we're going to discuss on the show today. In a few minutes, my friend and colleague Mike Curtis is going to join the program, who covers a number of things for us here at syracuse.com, football, men's basketball, women's basketball. Mike and I will focus a little bit on the basketball side of things. You know, the women's basketball team, it was quite an offseason for them, obviously, with everything that happened with Coach Q and a massive turnover on the roster. And people were kind of wondering how this team would be given all the new faces. Well, right now, things are going pretty well, actually. They've won four in a row, I believe. And Mike covered their latest win over Cornell last night and has been covering all along. So we'll get Mike's thoughts on how this team is doing right now. There's one name in particular that pops off the page, but a few talented players that are showing that, and if anything, this team's going to score a lot of points and could be a lot of fun to watch. We're going to talk some Syracuse men's basketball, of course, as well. Coming off that loss to Villanova, Georgetown up ahead on Saturday, and so we'll get to here shortly, and some thoughts on the rivalry itself. And some football nuggets as well. But you guys pop in the comments, whatever you want to talk about. We'll certainly react to it. So we'll get to Mike in a few minutes. But there was a couple of things I wanted to talk about right off the top here. And the first thing is that the Georgetown rivalry still matters, right? When you bring up a game against Georgetown, we kind of had those same feelings Tuesday against Villanova, right? Where they're playing Villanova again in Madison Square Garden, which had happened a time or two in the Big East tournament. And everybody kind of has those thoughts again about the Big East, and we missed the Big East, and why did Syracuse join the ACC? And, you know, you can't go backwards, right? It's not, I get these emails and tweets all the time, and I just kind of have to shake my head. It's like, guys, you can't go backwards. You know, the strategy is not to downshift. The strategy is not to say, let's leave all that ACC money on the table and go back to the good old days of the Big East, which literally is impossible because the Big East doesn't have a football league anymore. As much as basketball has led the way and dominates a lot of conversations when it comes to Syracuse athletics, you can't not play football. That being said, when you look at it, and we'll get into the football thing here in a minute, there is something about the nostalgia of Syracuse playing Georgetown that still matters to this generation. It's funny, kind of the world we're in right now, where just today I watched the trailer for Cobra Kai, right? If you're a fan of Cobra Kai, which I am a huge fan of that show, nostalgia's big. Who's watched the Beatles documentary, right? Which is extraordinary, by the way. The job they did on that is amazing. And to see the Beatles essentially in real time, you know, working on that last album and coming up with things and the creative process that they went through, that taps something. There's just generations of people that love the Beatles, and a new generation is learning all about, you know, their creative process and maybe getting into their music by, you know, the vessel that this documentary is, which is great. I can give a lot of other examples. Like I'm a big Star Wars fan, right? And how that has kind of bridged the gap between the past and the new generation. And I feel like that's what Georgetown can do. Right now, this generation kind of needs their own things to latch onto. And I think that Duke is that example, that great Duke Syracuse. I hesitate to call it a rivalry. I wouldn't necessarily call it a rivalry. It's just an electric series that these two have produced. But when you say Syracuse-Georgetown, even though Syracuse is in the ACC now, Georgetown's still in the Big East. And, you know, it's hard to get away from the past when Patrick Ewing is the head coach, when Dikembe Mutombo's son is on Georgetown. Obviously, here at Syracuse, Jimmy and Buddy Boeheim are playing for their dad now. So it just makes you feel older, right? As Mark notes here, Big East basketball in the 80s and 90s, the greatest league in sports history. Mark, I cannot disagree with it. There was nothing like it. There was absolutely nothing like it. If you watch the Requiem for the Big East 30 for 30, Dana O'Neill, shout out to her. She's got a new Big East book out. I have not read it yet. I'm definitely going to read it. I hear it's excellent in the stories that she tells there. So you can't go back to the past, but it doesn't mean you can't dip into it a little bit, right? But also bridge a gap and bring generations together. So if you're of my generation and Mark's generation and a generation even before that enjoyed Syracuse-Georgetown, you don't just have to tell old war stories about, Jim Boeheim coming in a press conference and saying, Michael Graham punched my player, or the great Patrick Ewing days, oranges hitting the backboard and Boeheim's got to grab the mic and say, stop throwing oranges at the backboard, and the Billy Owens free throws. And there's 100 stories about Syracuse-Georgetown. So you can't go back in the past, but the flexibility of the non-conference schedule and the willingness of Syracuse to play more name brand teams, not only willingness, but their hand's been kind of forced too, right? Because of the quad system, the way the NCAA tournament works now, and the quality non-conference opponents that you add there. That's why we've seen Syracuse play one of the most intense non-conference schedules they've ever played this year, right? The battle for Atlantis and the teams they played there. Obviously, they just played a top 5 team in Villanova this past week. You can't mix in a lot of the air quotes cupcakes, if you will. Now, Georgetown doesn't always cooperate in terms of what their net ranking is and their quad ranking would be, but there's room on the schedule for this game. There's room on the schedule for Villanova. There's room on the schedule for UConn. So, the best of both worlds is, I think, what you get here. As for this Georgetown team coming up, they're kind of an interesting team at this point, guys. I haven't watched a ton of Georgetown this year. I've seen them here and there and kind of getting ready for the game on Saturday. They just beat the Citadel 100-71. It was their first 100-point game since a 102-67 defeat of Howard a few years ago. And what's interesting about that is Caden Rice made 10 3-pointers on 12 attempts. 34 points. Georgetown is a 4-4 basketball team. And look, I think we know that when these two get together, you throw out the records, you throw out preconceived notions, how each team is playing. There's just the competitive spark that gets going when these two play. You look at recent history of Syracuse-Georgetown games in this new rivalry, not the past, the one they've renewed since both teams went their separate ways in terms of conferences. They're mostly competitive, and Georgetown has won a few of these, right? Ryan Mutombo gets in the game. Yep. No. Dikembe's son, 15 points, 11 rebounds in that game. So Georgetown's got an interesting mix of an inside-outside game. We've certainly seen what Syracuse does against 3-point teams. Villanova fires up 50 3-point attempts on Tuesday night. Just extraordinary to see that. They make 13, which ended up being enough. And, there's no such thing as a good loss, right? Nobody's going to sit here and pretend, that it's all kumbaya and rainbows and sunshine with this team right now. They're 5-4. They've got to beat Georgetown. They've got to win the games you're supposed to win, if you will, and go into ACC play as strong as can be. The most non-conference losses Jim Boeheim has had before conference play started was 5, and they're right on the precipice of that being a 5-4 basketball team right now. So it's just the wave of nostalgia that comes over you as a fan this week, I think is interesting, but mixed in with, the current state of affairs. Villanova is a top 5 team, and Georgetown's got some outside shooting. They've got some inside guys. One of their big guys is out hurt, but with Mutombo in there, Jimmy Boeheim, huge game on Tuesday for Syracuse in the paint. I think he's going to have more of a challenge in the paint. You want to see Jesse Edwards continue to play well. And the big thing with Syracuse right now, look, rebounding is an issue. It's always going to be an issue for this team. It just is. I mean, there's going to be games like the Florida State game this year and other games where they'll keep it competitive and maybe even win the rebounding battle. But more often than not, they're not going to. So you kind of have to, you exploit your strengths and you hide your weaknesses. Well, the strength for Syracuse, obviously, is 3-point shooting. And this is a team that goes hot and cold on 3-point shooting based on how opposing teams are facing them and how opposing teams are defending them. And right now, what's got to be number one on the to-do list for Syracuse is getting Buddy Boeheim open again. And look, if I'm a Syracuse opponent, that's the first thing on my list. Yeah, I've heard this Cole Swider guy can hit some threes, but he hasn't really proven it consistently yet. Jimmy can hit some from the perimeter. You don't really want to leave him open out there. And then, of course, Joe Girard, Logo Joe, he'll hit from anywhere. at this point. But the guy, if I'm an opposing coach and I'm Patrick Ewing and I'm looking at this game saying, what's my first priority? I deny Buddy Boeheim the ball, right? Villanova didn't quite swarm Buddy the way that Florida State did. Like Florida State said, come hell or high water, you are not going to win this game, meaning Buddy Boeheim, right? Buddy did get some open shots against Villanova, but define open, right? Open is, like a 1 second window to catch and shoot, and it closes quickly, right? So that's not going to be easy. Syracuse is a team that typically screens a lot right now, but they're going to have to figure out ways to get Buddy open. And Georgetown and Lehigh, their next two opponents, are not necessarily going to be huge challenges as much as previous games in that department. So hopefully Buddy gets going again there. But in terms of that, no rest for the weary for this team right now. In the last 16 days, Syracuse has played 6 games. 5 were away from home, and they had 4 travel days in there. So you know what that means? You only get 4 days of practice. I know what Allen Iverson once said. We're talking about practice, right? But it's important. That's where you go in the lab. That's where the 1-1-3 defense came from, right? That's where, figuring out how to spring Buddy open comes from. You got to get in there and try some things and work out the kinks, if you will. In the next 18 days, comparatively, Syracuse will play just 3 games, with 2 of those at home, and that game against Georgetown coming up in a couple of days. So as Michael Antonio says, this team is a brutal schedule up to now, lost half of their games. The top 5 teams, they're in a decent position and must take advantage of the next 4 games or so. Going in at the ACC at 9-4 is acceptable. And I think that's a great point. So that's certainly what you're looking to do. Go into ACC play only with 4 losses. Can they win out before Georgia Tech, which is a manageable game? Virginia is on New Year's Day, and they are certainly not as formidable as they usually are. They just lost to James Madison this week. So even into ACC play, Syracuse certainly has the potential here to go on a little bit of a run and build up some confidence. And the most important thing for them, build up some wins as we go here. Rob jumps in to say Auburn and Villanova look like great teams. Although fatigue may have been a factor in Syracuse's game against Auburn, they can view Villanova as a step forward, as a silver lining, and a way to feel like they're coming along. And look, I would never want to speak for Jim Boeheim, but, I've covered Jim enough, and you guys have certainly watched Jim enough over the years. And in those press conferences, I can, kind of read him in terms of like, is he really kind of ticked at the way his team played, or is he content with the way his team played, win or lose? And he kept coming back to that he feels like they're getting better, how their defense has stepped forward, that obviously they've got to work on the rebounding and some of the things that are notable deficiencies on this team. But I think he truly felt like they took a step forward. And you don't want to make a direct comparison to your team against a top 5 team like that, but it does kind of show some truths, right? Like Florida State was one extreme, because it's a 63-60 game where no one's making shots, and it's just like, who can gut it out, right? Indiana was on the other end of the spectrum, 112-110 overtime game where it's just, let's get nuts. And a great scene from Batman, you want to get nuts? Let's get nuts. That's what that kind of game was. Villanova is the kind of team kind of right in the middle, is going to show you who you are as a team when you play a really good team like that. And I think, again, there's no such thing as a good loss, but I think there were some steps forward that Syracuse can take from that game. And Rob, I agree with your points you made there. So our friend Mike Curtis is going to join us shortly here, and we'll talk some hoops with Mike. But I wanted to note this too, and I'll get Mike's thoughts on this coming up in a second, just to get a football note in there for those of you watching on the football channel right now. It's December 9th. Do we know who our offensive coordinator is? Right? It's been over a week, and Dino Babers is out there trying to find a new offensive coordinator for the Syracuse football team, which is a very important decision. And what I'm wondering, when the offensive coordinator comes in, are you going to stick to what you have now? Are you going to stick to ground and pound? Are you going to stick to, I got one of the best running backs in the country, I've got one of the better running quarterbacks in the ACC, and work on the other stuff? Or are you going to be given autonomy, if you will, to be like, no, this is college football and you got to throw the ball. So, hey, Garrett Schrader, we're going to work with you for now, but I need a quarterback that can throw. So I'm curious what the philosophy is going to be in terms of who their new offensive coordinator is going to be and what the approach is going to be there. Because look, essentially Dino Babers is the offensive coordinator, right? He's got a name and title and somebody that he wanted to work with, and Sterling Gilbert, who he had worked with before and kind of shared philosophies. And we saw how that turned out for the offense. It was a mixed bag, right? You got to give them credit for changing on the fly, recognizing what the situation was, that Tommy DeVito wasn't working out, and they had to run the ball. And that's who they were. And that's how they almost got over the hump and got that 6 win and got into a bowl game, right? But now that you have a chance to start anew, your recruiting class isn't looking that hot right now. And you can't go by rankings and stars and all that. I realize that. But it's rated the lowest in the ACC as we speak. The transfer portal has certainly seen more players leave Syracuse and go into it than they're gaining from the portal. With time, they're certainly got some offers out there and they're looking in the portal. But to me, the big thing is offensive coordinator. And right now, I have heard some names. I don't want to throw it out there for speculation's sake, but let's just say the names I've heard haven't exactly blown me over. And I think that's kind of the plan. There's not a lot of big names out there, right? And any big names like Mark Whipple, for example, it took him one day to go from Pittsburgh to Nebraska, right? So I don't think Syracuse is going to make a splash in terms of their hire, which is okay if you get a coach on the up and up and somebody who's, highly regarded in the industry and is ready to take a position, either a step up as an OC or, kind of lateral move, if you will, from another school, but a jump up in terms of competition, which is what I'm hearing some of the names they're looking at. I'm just curious what the philosophy is going to be. What are you going to try to do? Are you going to try and go back to orange is the new fast? You're going to ground and pound, or is it going to be some kind of Frankenstein version of both of them, right? All right, without further ado, friends, let's bring him in. There he is, the man, the myth, the legend, syracuse.com's Mike Curtis with us here. Michael, you are live on the interwebs. How are you?
Doing well, man. It's getting cold around here. Snow is finally in Syracuse. It really feels like Syracuse basketball weather now.
That's it. See, it's basketball weather when you got it. I had to use the shovel this morning. It wasn't just one of those, the snow will melt off the driveway type of deals. I actually had to go out there and shovel it today. So yeah, we're getting down to it, but not just the men's basketball team, which we'll talk about, Mike. Let's change gears and talk about this women's basketball team. Look, we were all curious how this was going to go, considering an offseason unlike any we've ever seen. And the transition at head coach, of course, but the transition on the roster, most notably, all the transfers, essentially a brand new roster for Vaughn Reed to put out there. And they certainly raised some eyebrows when they beat Ohio State recently, and they just have kept winning since. How have they done it?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Brent. I think we all had low expectations for this team pretty much because we didn't know who they were before they got here. But game by game, I think we've been able to kind of see what this team's identity is. They're going to play fast. They're going to get up a lot of three-pointers, and they're going to ride the back of pretty much each starter on that team because they're so shorthanded in the front court. Specifically, I think we were all focused on the transfers like Chrislyn Carr, Chrissy Carr, Najee Murray, and Alacia Styles. But I think we all forgot about the one player that Syracuse had on its roster for the past 3 years, and that's Tisha Hyman. Mm-hmm. And her performance for this team has been instrumental in how they've been playing, the offense they've been running. Vaughn Reed said it, I think it was the game before last after Central Connecticut State, like they essentially have 3 point guards when you throw in Chrislyn Carr, Tisha, and Najee, and either one of them can run the offense. They can hit shots and they can facilitate. But I think it all starts with Tisha. She almost had that quadruple double against Central Connecticut State, the 5th player in Syracuse history to record the triple double. And she's able to pretty much do anything you want out there on the basketball court.
Mike, you brought up Tisha in that Ohio State game. She had the triple double, almost a quadruple double in recent games. It feels like there's a mix here, like Ohio State ranked team, signature win, no doubts about that. But how much do we have to put into context in the conversation, the competition that Syracuse has played in this win streak?
Yeah, I think that's a big part of it. Like their signature and most noteworthy win came against a ranked opponent in Ohio State. If you want to mark that down as the only notable win, that's fair because the rest, they've played Cornell, they've played Central Connecticut State, they played Monmouth, not a lot of good teams, and they're blowing them out. I asked Coach Reed, what can you learn from these blowout wins? And he said the main thing that you want to get better at is your execution. So if they're doing that in anticipation that they're going to be playing stiffer competition once the ACC schedule kicks in, you got Clemson coming to the Dome on Saturday, and that's going to be the return of Kiera Lewis, who was their leading scorer last season. I'm wondering how they're going to defend her because she's 5'8". She's the same size as Tisha Hyman, but she's aggressive. And when she wants to score, when she flips that switch in her mind that she's going to attack this team, and I think she's gonna want to have a good game against her.
Sure, of course.
If I was her, I would try to go out and score 30 if I were her. But yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how they deal with her. Not only her, but also Delisha Washington, another all ACC guard over there at Clemson. So I think they're going to get a big test this Saturday when they play Clemson.
And the reunions are going to come a lot this year, Mike. You mentioned Kiara. Of course, Emily Angsler is now at Louisville. And you just wrote a story about this the other day. So give us a little recap of that, Mike. You just mentioned a couple of names there. But how are some of the bigger names that transferred from this team, Kiara, Emily Angsler, Camila Cardoso, how are they doing in those new places?
Yeah, for sure. So I did this piece where I tracked down the status and progress of each of 12 players from last year's team's roster transferred, but only 11 are playing. Lauren Fitzmaurice, I think she was a grad transfer, so she's pretty much graduated, got her degree. She's not playing anymore. But as far as the big names, Camila Cardoso is with South Carolina. She's playing really well, but she's coming off the bench, rightfully so, because Aaliyah Boston for South Carolina is starting, and she's just incredible. She's a force down low. She can rebound. She can score. And then once you add Camila Cardoso to that mix, you're bringing in someone who was the All-ACC Defensive Player of the Year and Rookie of the Year last year. And she's able to – we saw what she was able to do when she was at Syracuse. She can run the floor like a guard. She can block shots almost out to the three-point line. So she's picking up right where she left off at Syracuse. Kiera Lewis, she's performing well as well. I think she's top 5 in the ACC in steals. She's still continuing her scoring streak. Emily Angsler, this was a big piece for Louisville. The fact that Louisville got Emily, I think that puts them almost at the top of the ACC. Duke is there too. Duke is right there. They're undefeated. Kara Lawson is doing a phenomenal job with that team. They got a Maya Finkley. She backed up both Camilla and Maeva Jowdy-Tabi, who's at Miami. So there are a lot of players right now that used to wear orange last year. Some of the players who didn't get as much time last year, they're not doing as well in their new locations. But the one that is Kiera Fisher. She was a point guard when she was here at Syracuse, and she's at Marist right now. She's already had a performance of 25 points plus, and she's performing pretty well for that team as a starting point guard.
Well, it's interesting because obviously the women's team had so many more transfers go, but the men's team had, 4 guys go different places, and the success hasn't been quite there for those players. Kadari Richmond's getting in and out of the lineup. He was starting, not starting, back in the lineup. He had a great game the other day where he had 10 points, 9 assists, and I believe 8 rebounds, something like that. Robert Braswell is getting in the lineup at Charlotte, but hasn't really starred there the way he wants to. Quincy Guerrier wanted to shoot more threes at Oregon, and that's not going so well for him at Oregon in that department. He is playing for that team, but the threes aren't falling there. Yeah. Woody Newton is barely scratching the lineup there at Oklahoma State. So on the women's side, it feels like the grass was greener on the other side for a lot of these players, but on the men's side, they're still trying to find their way. And Syracuse has their big transfers, Jimmy Boeheim and Cole Swider. And you go back to Tuesday night, Mike, and what was the Cole Swider Bowl, right? And while he wasn't scoring, he had 12 rebounds, and he's had 4 games this year with 10 or more rebounds. And, of course, Jimmy Boeheim just took advantage of some mismatches and ended up with 21 points on the day. So there's no such thing as a good loss, but I feel like you got to feel pretty good about a few things if you're Syracuse, that you hung with a top 5 team for most of that game.
Yeah, that game against Villanova was very interesting. I felt like Syracuse was there for the first half, and you probably really thought that they could come out with the upset win over a number 6 opponent in the team in the country. And then it seemed like Villanova, as soon as halftime came, they flipped the switch. They said, we're going to shoot these shots, we're going to crash these boards, and we're going to be more aggressive, and you're not going to be able to stop us. And it all came down to like rebounding. They were out rebounded by I think 20 or so. And then you can't have a night where Buddy Boeheim only scores 6 points in back-to-back games. That's 12 points over the last two. 0 for 9 from 3-point over the last 2 games. I think he went 0 for 5 against Florida State and 0 for 4 against Villanova, or it was mismatched. But you can't have that. That's your star player. And if he's not going, then oftentimes you're not. And if your other players aren't helping them out on offense, you're not going to have much success. So I think Buddy Boeheim needs to have a big game this weekend against Georgetown. I also think that Joe Girard needs to kind of be a little bit more aggressive. You saw him take his opportunities in the Villanova game where he had a couple of mismatches and he was able to capitalize on them, step backs, tough mid-range shots. But I like to see him shoot a little bit more. And Cole Swider, I think he just needs to keep doing what he's doing. He's a phenomenal rebounder, as we've seen so far this season, but he just needs to get down that shot. He was touted as a shooter when he got here, but he's been a little bit inconsistent. So yeah, I think it'll be interesting, and Georgetown this weekend will be a big test for Syracuse.
It will. They've got a good outside shooter who just had a career day with 10 3-pointers in a game. Mutombo's son in the middle. They've got kind of a good combo of size and strength. And Georgetown, some of their opponents aren't exactly world beaters, and Syracuse has played a tougher schedule, but Mike, it's a rivalry game, and you just throw everything out the window. And there's been some great games between these two. And you brought it up with Buddy. I mean, man, Florida State in particular, but Villanova too. They're just throwing everything in the kitchen sink at this guy. They're denying him opportunities. He typically does start slow, believe it or not, for a guy that's hit all those threes. He kind of warms up as the season goes. But now combine that with the fact that teams are saying, come hell or high water, you're not getting the basketball. So that's where Cole, as you brought up, is such a difference maker if he can get those open shots. Joe's taken what's there, and so far it's been pretty good. Yeah. Mike, I think another thing here is not that Jim Boeheim typically goes deep on his bench, but look, I like what I see from Symir Torrance. He's a change of pace guard, great handle, distributes the ball well, got in a little foul trouble against Villanova, so he couldn't do much there. Frank Anselm's just a great backup to Jesse, and I don't think there's really much you can ask him to do in terms of impact. Yeah. Benny Williams is the intriguing guy to me. And you got to be fair because he's a freshman and he's finding his way. Not all these freshmen, come in out of the box ready to go. I don't care how many stars they have next to their name. They got to get used to college basketball. Yeah. But it does feel like he can do more. So I wonder if Georgetown and these upcoming games could kind of be a catalyst for him to get going and provide a little scoring punch off the bench.
Yeah, that's a good point. Benny Williams is definitely struggling. I remember earlier in the season, especially in those exhibition games, you could count him down for at least one highlight block. And that's pretty much what got the crowd going, especially at these home games at Syracuse. But he has been struggling. I know last game he had an offensive foul and Jim Boeheim took him out. And I don't think we saw him again until the second half. So I'm kind of interested in seeing if Boeheim didn't have him on such a short leash. And I think the game before that against Florida State, he took a 3-pointer, which was uncharacteristic of him. And I don't think he saw the floor for maybe even the rest of the game. So I think he's on a pretty short leash when it comes to just doing what he wants to do. And I think it's kind of like Cole Swider mentioned it earlier in the season when he was struggling with his shot. And he mentioned that Jim Boeheim kept him in the game and said, hey, I'm not going to take you out if you miss a couple. I think that right there instills confidence in your players. And if you're constantly worried about messing up, drawing an offensive foul or taking a bad shot, doing a wrong post-up move, not boxing out and getting a rebound like we saw in the Indiana game, you're constantly worried about like having your coach over your shoulder, that can affect your confidence. So I think we might be seeing a little bit of that with Benny Williams.
At the same time, though, I see where Jim's coming from. When you go back to, go back to the Indiana game, and they won that game, right? They got to overtime and won, but that play right at the end there of regulation, Benny just out of position, not boxing out, didn't even jump for the rebound. And it's an interesting mix, Mike, because you can't teach those things in practice. Like, you can bust your hump in practice all you want. You can't teach that stuff. That comes from experience. That, as you said, with Cole.
Never forget that.
The difference with Cole, of course, is he's played for a few years and Benny's a freshman. So it's an interesting balance there, but they need him. I mean, one way or the other, no matter how we slice this pie, there's just that extra player in the paint that they need, because sometimes Jesse is not quite on his game offensively, unfortunately, the other night. By the way, what a weird statistical oddity. He was the only player that got to the free throw line in that game for Syracuse, which was weird, right? So Benny's just that extra punch that this team needs, and maybe they're getting close to seeing that happen.
Yeah, and I wanted to go back to Buddy a little bit. I think he's still getting adjusted to the new personnel that's on the team. He's not used to playing with his older brother, Jimmy, who's, let me tell you, he's getting those shots up. I think every time he touched the ball last game, he didn't look to facilitate. He didn't look to pass. He was trying to make a play. He has this type of old man game where he backs you down, just throws up the floater or the jump hook, and it goes in. And that's good for Syracuse. I think Jimmy has actually exceeded a lot of people's expectations by coming from this team. A lot of people didn't think he could play at Syracuse. But I think Buddy is still trying to get adjusted to when he should take his shots. Should he wait on Cole to get heated up? Should he wait on Jimmy to get involved? So I think he just takes what he has left. And I think once he figures that out, once they work through that chemistry issue, then they'll be in a better position offensively.
Mike, I want to end on a football note here, as we're in a very interesting offseason, and signing day is coming up next week. And, Syracuse is rated one of the lowest teams in the ACC, if not the lowest team in the ACC. So we'll see how that shakes out. The transfer portal, we've seen many more players go into it than Syracuse is gaining from it at this point. They do have some offers out, so we'll see what comes in there. I'm just kind of curious what you think about the rebuild they're doing, right? In that they're bringing in new coaches, the biggest one being the offensive coordinator position. And I was talking about it a few minutes ago about the choice you got to make if you're Dino Babers and whoever the new OC will be. Do you keep going with this kind of ground and pound, great running quarterback combined with Sean Tucker approach, or do you have to open things up again, or maybe mix the two together? I guess that's the obvious answer there, because you got to throw the football in this sense. So combined with what our colleague Nate Mink wrote about today, a great piece, folks. If you haven't seen it, I would encourage you to read it, about how far behind Syracuse is in the facilities arms race out there in college sports. Syracuse is in an interesting position here, because they're not going to get a wow, headline name to be the offensive coordinator, but they still have to retool and kind of get this thing back on track. And Mike, they're one win away. Man, they win one more football game. You and I are previewing a bowl game coming up in a couple of weeks.
Yeah, and I think that one win away, the difference right there was those stretch of games that they lost by 3 points, which is why they're expected to hire a new special teams coordinator. You got to make those field goals, or you got to get yourself in a position where you can win those games, or you can get those 3 points that could be the difference. But as far as this team going forward, I think it's all about the identity. Do they want to be a passing focused team? Do they want to run the ball through Sean Tucker? Or do they have to cater to their personnel? Their personnel says they need to just ground and pound it. So are you bringing in an offensive coordinator who's going to emphasize that, or are you going to bring in someone else in hopes that you can get other recruits or other players to kind of fit that coordinator's philosophy? So I think Dino Babers, he's always been about the orange is the new fast. We're going to throw the ball down, deep passes, whatever, but he kind of had to adjust on the fly given Sean Tucker's emergence. So I think he has an interesting decision coming up. And I'll be interested to see which way he goes.
Mike, it's great to see you again. Keep up the good work on all things coming your way, the variety of stuff you're writing about for us. And I'll be looking for more coverage to come. We got Georgetown this weekend, women's team keep going. And as mentioned, all these football issues popping up with signing day and other things around the corner. But thanks for coming on with us once again, my friend. We'll see you soon.
No problem. I don't know if you saw, but Sherrod Johnson has entered the transfer portal.
There's another one. My goodness. Syracuse is in contention for the Portal Cup at this point as the most players into the transfer portal. So there you have it. News as it happens. Mike, we'll talk to you again soon. Thanks, buddy.
Thanks, man. Take care.
There he goes, the one and only Mike Curtis. Make sure you are reading his great work at syracuse.com. Follow him on Twitter for all the latest. And Mike covers so much for us. I joke around with Mike that he's making a run at Lindsey Kramer. Another one of our great writers is the Swiss Army knife of syracuse.com, meaning like he's got all the gadgets on one thing. He can do everything. He can write about, badminton at this point, if you ask him to. He's done high school sports, SU, men's and women's basketball, football, you name it. Mike will write about it. We appreciate his perspective and insight as always. So there you have it. Another player in the transfer portal. Good gracious. Syracuse has got a lot of names to replace. So we'll see what they do in recruiting. We'll see what they do in the portal themselves. That'll be news coming up. Our coverage of Georgetown coming up this week. That's a 12 o'clock tip time. So for those of you that like to watch our post-game show here on these same channels, I'll be with you there about 2 o'clock or so after the Orange take on the Hoyas. And as always, we thank you for watching Orange Weekly and, of course, reading all our great work on syracuse.com. If you do miss the show live, again, we pop it up on its own post on syracuse.com. You can look for it on our social media channels or look for it archived on Syracuse Orange Sports on YouTube. Make sure you give all those channels a follow so you get a notification when the show is live and so you can check out the replay if you miss it. You guys have a great rest of your week. All right. Thanks for hanging with us today on Orange Weekly. My name is Brent. It's all presented by our friends at Crouse Health, and we'll talk to you next time.